perspective. So first, your first reactions to the film, and before I go to the other guests, Anastasia, would you like to share some of your experience in making this film and some of the most important things that you want to convey with the movie?
Well, any movie, it's always a simplification. So I'm always upset. You know, many things could be better explained with many supported data documents. So please feel free to ask me any questions. What proofs do you have? Because back this movie, we have a lot of, you know, much more evidence than it was exposed. About is Russia a kleptocracy? Since I think 5 years we have even books, Putin's kleptocracy or mafia, post-communist mafia state. There are many researchers who study it seriously. Mafia state, it is not an insult, in fact this is a system. What is important about it, why the name of Putin's friend or Putin's cellist appears. Apparently a head of such a corruption or mafia state has his interests in any deal, any you know, oil company, but not only. So we found the names of Mr. Roldugin and his partners in government procurements. In, for example, there was a foreign company who paid bribes to them without any obvious reason, but the only explanation is that there is a total control of you know, every dealings with Russia, even if you're a foreign company. So.
You mentioned the word, it's a system, it's systematic. In the beginning of your movie, you kind of present Putin as if he is rolled into the system because they needed a guy like him. And I felt, well, that takes away some of the agency of himself putting him there. How much of his rise is due to the systematic requirements and how much of it is himself?
Yes, it's a very good question. Well, before we were speaking about transition, it was believed that Russia was from the way from dictatorship to a democracy, but it did not happen. What happened, you know, the famous assets of the Communist Party abroad were stolen by KGB people and also people close to criminality. It even started in the 80s. These people like Gennady Petrov, boss of Mafia gang, he was informant of KGB, so they obviously started to work together because of necessity to enrich themselves, but to realize that they needed also criminality. And Putin is a part of the system. I think he is very good because I very liked the answer of Bill Browder. I don't think it is in the movie. Why Putin? Why does he need any money? Because he can't use it in an open way. And he said because in a country like Russia, only the richest man could be a president. As far he's not the most rich, he will be thrown from power. And I even know some cases when Mr. Sechin or Mr. Chubais, oligarchs or people, let's say from Putin's circle, but they tried to steal money without notifying Putin. After that, and there was a mistake, they were scolded and they were brought back to normality. So in that way, I think Putin is not only greedy or something. No, really, the purpose of all this is to control everything what's happening around. And it's even used like a justification that, well, we had criminal groups, we had like oligarchs, and Putin was needed Putin needed to control it. But well, let's go back to his personal responsibility. I want to believe other any another way of development of Russia is possible, was possible, and still is in the future.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on in this first round. Maybe Harry, sitting next to him, going to stand on the other side. Harry Hummels, from the Netherlands Helsinki Committee, but also formerly from Amnesty International, if I understand correctly. So if you're looking at it from a human rights perspective and then look at this movie, it must be your first reaction must be quite disappointed in how Russia turned out.
Yes, well, I'm not a Russia expert, in particular in my amnesty period. I did not work on Russia or Eastern Europe, especially. The Netherlands Helsinki Committee, of course, does work, on countries in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. In a lot of these countries, you see similar developments to a lesser or a bigger degree. So a term like kleptocracy, I think Russia and a number of other countries, this region has become an engine for kleptocracy in the world. And therefore, and this in my view is closely linked to human rights abuse. The corruption itself, there's a lot of theoretical discussion on whether this can be called a human rights violation. In my view it is, because it implies extremely unjust decision making about how resources are distributed. It implies stealing of public resources which could be used for other purposes, social purposes. It implies corrupting the rule of law and twisting the rule of law. And in the end it implies killing and imprisoning people is the ultimate consequence. So this, for me, as someone from a human rights background, is an important, or is the most important motive to include looking at corruption in our work. The Magnitsky campaigning done by Bill Brauder has led to legislation in the United States listing people who were involved in siphoning off this couple of $100 million and in imprisoning and killing Magnitsky, placing them on the sanctions list and freezing their assets that are in the United States. This then has led to legislation on a more generic scale, what they call Global Magnitsky Act, which applies or opens the possibility at least to apply the same measures against people worldwide who engage either in serious human rights abuses or in or systematically corrupt. So this is then something that now has been adopted also by a couple of other countries in Europe, in particular in the Baltic states, and European Parliament has started talking about doing this at the European level. But this is still, a big discussion, and should become a big discussion in Europe whether we want to apply this type of measures, this type of legislation in Europe.
Why? Why would it be a big discussion?
Well, it would be
Should
a big
we want
discussion
to,
because
we don't know the list,
there are several elements. There are hundreds of millions of euros in different European countries invested. The housing market in London, or the upper end of the housing market, to a large extent depends on these folks. And this is not all people from whom corruption has been proven. But if you use a term like money laundering, you come closer already, I think, to what can be proven. If you would start applying a test on these people that they have to, certify where their assets come from before they buy real estate, well, in London or in any other city, many of them would fail the test.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a whole series of similar examples, and so this is one aspect. Another aspect is, legal systems and if you look at the Netherlands, we have this famous system of letterbox companies, and where you can hide your ownership, where there have been investigative journalists in the Netherlands who have found that a number of the companies registered in Amsterdam are owned by Russian persons from Russia who turn up in these investigations on links between criminality and the Russian government. In one case, at least, there is someone who is on the official European sanctions list, European Union sanctions list, which has been drawn up because of mostly Crimea, Ukraine, interference of Russia, and this person is on this list. He is not supposed to be an owner of a Dutch company, because this means that they have to have a real business in the Netherlands, and this cannot be done because he's on the European Union sanctions list.
Yeah.
But still, the Dutch government apparently does not want to take real steps and close down this company.
Or if I can summarize, part of you're basically acknowledging much of it is a kleptocracy, and you're describing some of the ways they're trying to get the money out of Russia, and how we deal with it more is the next area. So because I first wanted to see, how do you feel when you look at a film like this, and then just from your personal perspective before we move on to the next speaker.
Well, as Anastasia was saying, this is an overview in a way, looking at the number of the things that are happening. Over the past years, I've been reading and hearing much about these things, because I think it is essential if you look at the human rights struggle of people in Russia and people who care about Russia. So the film itself for me was not surprising, but of course the whole
you knew about this. That's why we invited you. Thanks. Okay, well, maybe we can bring the microphone over. Mr. Grozhev, Krzysztof Grozhev, you're at Bellingcat, but also at the university. We're going to talk a little bit more about what you do, but let's see what you felt when you were looking at the movie first, and then my follow-ups. Yes.
When I watched the movie, actually, my other background came more appropriate, which was my time in Russia as a businessman. I was working through the 90s in St. Petersburg and Moscow as the founder of some of the first commercial radio stations there. And my first radio license actually in St. Petersburg was personally signed by a Mr. Putin, who we thought was just a regular clerk in the office of mayor. But interestingly, a musical metaphor that has been chasing me, and it was funny coming back today with the cello, is that after we applied as a completely clean, above-board, American-owned company trying to get licenses for many years and never got any, we had to buy some existing stations, but we never got a license through a open procedure. One day, and it was already at the time when Putin was in power in Moscow, one day we were told, well, you're never going to get a license, but you can get a freshly acquired license that somebody else has acquired, and for that, if you want to talk about it, just go to this and this address on Tverskaya Street. So I went to Tverskaya Street. This address happened to be a music store, a music instrument shop.
Very expensive instruments.
I was told to go to the second floor and to go to the brass section. I went to the brass section, and then a store clerk came over to me. He literally twisted a knob on a tuba on the wall, and the door opened. And I had to go into a completely blank office with nothing inside, which is behind the wall. And there was an official from the government who told me, 4 million and you have the license tomorrow. So the music metaphor is amazing. It goes through the whole Putin time. But one thing that is missing in the movie, there's a lot of music instruments. One thing that is missing, and I think it's partly because to Russians that's so evident that they didn't feel the need to put it. It's a convention about how Putin transitioned, how Russia transitioned from Yeltsin to Putin. A convention that has a legend as well associated with it. And the convention goes that actually it was the oligarchs that found Putin to be extremely convenient for them, much more convenient than even Yeltsin, who had his own ambitions and his own family to actually run business with or through. And they thought this was a very nice, supportable, manageable guy. And they invested hundreds of millions of media time to promote him and to take his side in all of the possible conflicts. And then Putin essentially cheated them all, that's the convention, by turning against them and starting prosecuting some of them and expelling some of them or declaring them persona non grata. Now this, part of this is true, factually it is true. The legend that the Russian population, or a large part of the Russian population believes in, is that he did it for good reasons. Yeah, he did it to get rid of the new aristocracy of oligarchy that had just emerged. And then when they're confronted with facts like, but he did it to gain power himself, then the reaction is, we don't care about that. Yeah, and here comes a question, or a big question that I think we should discuss in the second part, I'm just suggesting, which is this the only route that Russia as a country could have taken?
Right.
And unfortunately, many people, including intellectuals, including academics in Russia, believe that Russia is so intrinsically different as a society because of its imperial history of being Tsar managed, that it can never have a different line, and that's complete fallacy. That's my opinion.
One more.
Sure.
I wanted to follow up. You mentioned you're part of a radio company before, and you're also studying, I read, the weaponization of information, which is one of the aspects. It's not that present in the film, but it does. Whenever something sensitive comes up, information turns out to be one of the most dangerous things for this kind of regime. Is that part of what you're studying, or is it more of the troll farm studies that are taking over the American elections?
Well, let's say I started studying that before the troll farms developed, so it predates that. I think my area of study of weaponization stems from my time in Russia in media, because in the several years after Putin became president, he decided he cannot tolerate foreign-owned free media. And all of the foreign owners started being edged out of the market through Putin finding appropriate buyers for them that would offer any amount of money just to get rid of foreign owners. So for me, I developed an interest in what will happen after we are bought with the media that we will be leaving behind. And of course I had media assets in several countries, several cities in Russia, and I continued the relationship with the people after we were forced to sell. And the first thing that they told me, the directors of news in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Sochi told me the day after we had to sell, was we were told that there can be no further negative news. So no negative news at all. It's all positive from that. So that to me was a sobering shock, and I started following what is going to happen in the media landscape in Russia. And that was 2006, and basically that has progressed into a very fine-tuned machine, which it is today. And talking about that and how it works will take at least a week.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to move to the other side so I can also look at Jonathan. Mr. Hill, from GLM, but you're also formerly from the UEFA and from the European Commission, so a long history of potentially dealing with Russia. Also, your first thoughts when you saw the film just now?
My first thought, and this was particularly strong towards the end of the film, where we see the darker side of what's happening. And I'd just like to pay tribute to everybody on this panel, who I think are all engaged in some way in the biggest battle facing liberal democracy at the moment, whether that's in Europe or North America. And it's fundamentally a fight for truth. And I think one of the greatest threats posed by the Putin regime, we've seen the kleptocracy, and that is already a huge threat. But I think it's part of a wider attack on the very idea of truth, the notion of truth, whether we can establish truth and whether we want to believe in truth and defend truth. And I pay tribute to all the people on this panel and looking at the bravery of Anastasia making that film and the bravery of Bellingcat and the human rights organisations across Europe. I think of Carol Cadwaladra at The Guardian in my country, who's coming under enormous abuse in the UK because she's digging into the Russian influence on the Brexit referendum. So that was my first reaction. Wow, thank God we had these brave people out there fighting for the institutions of our democracy.
We're also happy to have you here, obviously.
I'm not a brave man.
No, well, aren't you in a campaign, like a legal campaign against Russia?
Well,
how is that not part of this?
I won't go too far into the details of our campaign. I'll be very happy to talk about it afterwards over drinks in the bar.
Sure.
In a nutshell, I am the spokesman for the former Yukos shareholders. We've been fighting a legal battle in The Hague, here in the Netherlands, for more than 10 years now. In 2014, an independent tribunal in The Hague reached a unanimous conclusion that Yukos had been illegally and brutally expropriated.
Yukos is an oil company that was working in Russia.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. And all of the assets of Yukos went to Rosneft. And we can come back to that later, because I think the position of Igor Sechin in this film is not innocent.
It sounds like your answer to is it a kleptocracy is also taking shape.
Oh, it's a very big yes.
Exactly.
I would like to say in a nutshell, both Anastasia and Christo alluded to the idea of the path not taken. I'm not a Russia expert, but I do know about the enormous contribution of Russia as a civilization, through science and technology, through the arts, through literature, through sport, through everything. And I think we have to believe, as human beings, we have to believe that the Russian people deserve better and that there can be a better future for Russia. And I think the Yukos case symbolises a road not taken. Nobody would argue that Mr. Khodorkovsky was an angel, but what did he do? What did he do? And at the start of the century, he saw a different path, and he introduced OECD standards of corporate governance into Yukos. He started publishing quarterly financial reports. He published the entire ownership structure of Yukos. You're absolutely right, Harry. We're having a very good and important debate across Europe today in the nature of shell companies and offshore finance and money laundering. In 2002, we published our entire ownership structure, so you could see who owned which percentage of the company, full transparency. And I think that was part of the threat to Vladimir Putin and his regime, because you can't deal with that degree of transparency if you're running a mafia state. It doesn't fit.
It's something that triggers the combination between the first and latter part of your answer, because you said in the beginning this is really a fight for truth, and then the kleptocracy can't really, the information can't really see the light of day. And what I noticed in the movie, and you can respond to that in a second if you also want, at some point the story with the instruments to Sochi and everything, you said, we doubt this version of the facts. But what I was thinking, well, that there are no facts here. Like, everything is under a blanket of mystery and threats, and you're not allowed to even investigate. So even if we start calling this a version of the facts, shouldn't we just say this is a big lie and obviously it's not true? It's very mild. That's what I was thinking when I was looking at it.
The freedom of press in Russia is at 154th place among only 180. It's indeed a challenge, and even for foreign journalists to discover some hard evidence, because foreign journalists, in its turn, often rely on local stuff, and when it's not published, I admire any researchers, but how to work when you don't have initial data, because there's not freedom of press. So why there's a focus in the 90s. In the 90s, it was still possible at least to do parliamentary commissions and whatever, and then it was abandoned. So, but look, when Putin is asked about something directly, for example, why your signature is on this document, which is really criminal, Putin just answered, "It does not exist."
In my version of that.
Or only general things or Sergei Roldugin, the cellist, is a good person. Okay, but what
Why
about
is, yeah, that's not an answer.
what about overseas company and Panama,
Yeah.
etc.? Never he goes into details.
But in the movie, like, obviously the movie is making very powerful points, but you also stay quite polite in this, like by saying we don't really believe this version of the facts. Is that also, I mean, you're being commended on fighting the good fight, but is it also scary to be too open? Are you? Is it sensitive to make a documentary with more statements like this is a lie, this is a criminal act? How does that feel?
Yes, it was very, very difficult because it was for French public television, and despite the fact the contract was signed, you know, the preliminary synopsis script was submitted. It took us 6 months to get it broadcasted, and it was broadcasted in August at midnight.
Really?
Yeah, because it's public television, so probably you can do something harder, but you know, to show it only for experts or just in the internet, whatever. Just I wanted to tell. I think you know, in the movie, in the end, there's a KGB major general who is calling me on my mobile. I installed the program of automatic recordings for such cases. But what is striking, this is the person responsible for Magnitsky case. Bill Browder is trying to sue him in London. He's already a British citizen, everything. He has a company in the United States. But he was also working with Putin in 1991 in the famous City Hall. And this is a good news for me in many cases that from the first appearance were not linked to Putin, to the 90s, etc. Finally, they are. So probably it is still possible to, you know, to win against this scrutiny.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're producing an actual version of the facts, because the other thing is more a version of the lies. But Honorata, because the first round is almost, like, I wanted to also give you the floor. We heard you before. You mentioned we have to look out for the transition between somebody taking over government, but then government grabbing all the companies. Can you, in that second part, can you explain a little bit? Because I have the idea that in the beginning, Putin was already chosen by the companies, and it was just waiting to happen for them to become more entangled. But you're mentioning it as a takeover. Could you explain why you mean that?
Well, so I think there are again two levels playing here. So we have the local level, and actually Putin at that time is working on the local level. And there I told you that actually there the control of the state of the assets was already there. And he proved that actually he is very good at it. That's why he was a good candidate,
right, yeah,
for Yeltsin, right? He thought, okay, as a state manager, he will make sure that the assets we have, they will be kept in place. For the oligarchs, well, the legend is that perhaps he was the one who would be favorable because he would let them go and do their things and just let them in peace. And actually that promise was made also to them somewhere in secret, right? Yes. That was the deal that happened there. To the public, however, there was the idea given that he is going to actually bring justice and get rid of corruption, get rid of the oligarchs, bring the money back to the people. So I think he played actually all the games at the same time.
Right.
Of the state capture, of the business capture, and then the kind of legitimacy game with the population. And I think that's something that each party underestimated at that point in time when that opening happened. I think that would be my interpretation here.
Okay, so yeah, he was an amazing poker player and on a very, very high level.
Maybe he didn't know it himself at that time yet, but he was playing these games, and in the end it really brought him to this powerful position.
Yeah, because it's all centralized now.
Yeah.
In the movie, somebody mentions a smart Russian administrator never puts his signature on anything. They let somebody else do it. Is that why it's very clear, like even traditionally maybe, that Russia is a kleptocracy? that power is just something to be wielded for your personal gain and not really for the public interest? You just want to get out of it what you can?
Well, I think there are, again, two things happening here.
Oh,
so, sorry, I will
always
do
so complex.
it really, really quickly, but it's always more complex than it seems. So we talked about the information, and I immediately thought, oh, Weber. Of course, Weber said that information is the source of power for the authorities, and the other side of information is secrecy, right? So it plays in here very well. You can play with the information, you show what you want to show, and you keep secret whatever you want to keep secret. But the fun part here in the movie is that they use the information media, so the television, radio, newspapers, to basically present their version of reality. So actually there is no evidence that can be held against them, just as you said, this doesn't exist, right? This signature doesn't exist simply because they go on TV and say, well, look at this, I'm in power, of course they tell me that I'm corrupt, of course they tell me that I signed something, but this is just because I'm in power, and everybody else is jealous, obviously, for the power that they have. And that's the kind of thing that they don't say, but it's assumed somewhere in the smile of Putin, I guess.
And
yeah.
he's doing this.
And,
So he's obviously lying.
Some tick
That's the bad poker player doing.
Yes. So I think the information, the secrecy, and then, well, yeah, kleptocracy is quite obvious, and Karen Davisha also wrote this brilliant book where she tries to prove step by step the links between the businesses and corrupt practices in power in Russia, and she got in trouble academically as well in it, because in the end you don't get the right signature on the paper, and you can't show it, so it's just probably as in the movie.
Yeah, it's hard. So in this first topic, we're diving into the state of Russia, what we just saw. Are there any questions to the panel about that before we head on looking towards what other actors can do and looking towards the future? Any questions? Yes, sir. If you could stand up, then we can all hear you. Thanks.
And my question is, in fact, the early years of Putin. Like, is it a fact that secret agencies usually try to run a country? Because for me, it's not really clear how you become a KGB agent and then a public servant. Can you elaborate on that? Like, whether the KGB used to run Soviet Union, and we just never were aware of that.
The deep state. Who would like to pick that question up? Thank you for your question.
Was it addressed to me or?
It was to the panel, I guess.
It was to the panel, but if you want,
Anybody
you can
wants to
answer.
I can.
Yeah, you can. Then you go.
Go.
Yes. Spoken enough.
In 1990, so 1 year before the collapse of Soviet Union, KGB agents received like an order to establish joint ventures. For example, there is one established in Liechtenstein where Putin was involved, well, his friend, not him directly. And it appears, according to testimonies they started to give, it was the practice everywhere else. Well, in Liechtenstein, they wanted in Switzerland, I think.
Lugano.
Also, so in fact, there was no prohibition for KGB agents afterwards to take public positions, and also many of them were fired. Yeltsin did not close completely KGB, but he separated it in different agencies, and also I don't remember the exact figure, but it's huge, like at least 100,000 former KGB officers suddenly became unemployed, and they offered their services, to Mafia. There was an interview with Yakuza, former Yakuza. It was very funny when he explained that his partner from St. Petersburg Mafia was arrested in 1993, and KGB people came at his building, and at that moment the poor Yakuza got scared because real troubles began.
These are people whose fingers are cut off for random reasons and they got scared of the KGB. That says a lot.
They're representatives still of the state, so this is not normal, but at the same time they are mafia. So.
Yeah.
They are even not good mafiosos, not like Italian or the Japanese was shocked how it was.
Christian, you
If
want
I
to
could
add?
add a little bit to that.
Sure.
Every other East European country that transitioned from communism has had to a different degree, a declassification or opening up of the archives of the membership of the former security services. It happened usually 10 years after the collapse of communism, in some countries early, in others a bit later. In every country where this has been disclosed, miraculously, everybody finds that those people, especially in high positions, are overrepresented in the current business ownership of the country. Whether in banking, whether in just industrial holdings or in media, but on average about 70 to 80% of the leading figures in business belong to the secret services. Now Russia is the only country in Eastern Europe, other than Belarus, that hasn't declassified this data. We can only assume that that has been the case there, except at a much higher level. And the mechanism for that was exactly as Anastasia described it. Days or months before the collapse of communism, or years, there were suitcases with cash that were given to trusted people in order for them to perpetuate the economic interests of the class. And they went to Liechtenstein, to Vienna. A lot of them opened up banks in Vienna to manage the money after what they knew was going to be the collapse of the system.
Thanks. Maybe another question, or are you all ready to go to the next? You just want to know what? Oh, there's two questions all of a sudden. No, next. You first, and then you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to play a bit devil's advocate here, because when you watch this movie, you kind of get a feeling that Putin is kind of selfish, that he does all these things to get himself wealthy. But at the same time, you said something very interesting, Anastasia. You said that in a system like in Russia, someone needs to accumulate all this wealth and all this power in order to become a president, in order to become able to change something. And maybe this is with wishful thinking of mine, but could it be that he has better intentions than what we can see now in this movie, that he really wants his country to evolve in such a way? Because this movie gives a feeling that it's just based on selfishness.
Yeah, well, first, I'm not the unique author of this movie. There was a second person, my French colleague, Nicolas Tonev. I think we slightly disagree on it, but also the answer is very silly. In the press, to promote something, you have to simplify it. So for French television, it was already complicated enough. And if you were explaining that, okay, Putin is enriching himself, but not only him, but all the people around and whatever, it's really complicated. But it should be explained, I don't know, in academic researches, in the books, etc. But indeed, the idea was not that Putin just he's greedy and he's mentally ill or something because he needs all this money. It's more complicated.
But I mean, that's not just the money. You're also saying he kills people. That doesn't sound like a very well-meaning kind of strategy to me.
Yeah, they poison people also. Well, I don't know what to say. When somebody is killed, like Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya, before, every time there were versions, probably Putin does not know anything, or Boris Nemtsov. Somebody just wanted to make him pleasure or whatever. But now I think people start to think seriously about it. Just indeed, it's not possible. Many Russian mafiosos were detained in Spain and put on the tape, and they discussed. It was Anna Politkovskaya's murder. They discussed, of course, it's our Tsar. It was so open. Of course, it's not the final proof, but still, for me, it was amazing to learn.
So you'd like to also add, obviously, like the question is there a bigger scheme that is actually benefiting the Russian people, even though these means might be very bad?
Well, it depends which Russian people. Russian people are benefited. Yes, it's just a small minority.
A few of them, yeah.
Yes, but it's a very appropriate question. When the Panama Papers were published, I was in Budapest having dinner with on the same day with a former Russian Secret Service general, And he said, you don't understand anything. The whole West doesn't understand it. Yes, of course, the money with the cellist, I mean, of course, it's stolen money, and it's money that was paid back from kickbacks from Gazprom sales abroad and so on and so forth. So of course, 2 billion there, 4 billion there, but it's not Putin's personal money. This is the slush fund. I said, what is a slush fund? Obshak. Whose is that slush fund? Oh, it's officially called the Stability Fund. I said, officially? So there's even a statute? No, like officially, what Putin likes to call it is a Stability Fund. It's the fund that will ensure the perpetuation of the current system in Russia, which we think is a good system, yeah? He said. Without such a slush fund that we can use as needed for whatever is needed, this system will collapse and it will become a failed democracy like it was in the 90s. So it is a slush fund. That's how they perceive it. It's not only his. It belongs to him and many others. They're using it to finance election meddling. They're using it to finance whole political parties in your country as well. And they're using it to also make their own investments into houses that they need. And that's the real answer. Why does he need so much money? He doesn't. One argument is very correct. He needs to seem to be the wealthiest in this group of other wealthy people in order for him to have the political alpha dominance over them. But also a small part of that money is used for themselves. The rest is used to perpetuate forever this system. And that's the risk.
Yeah, because we are going to get to
it was not said about transgressions. First, Honorat Mazepos were speaking about oligarchs, but the problem, oligarchs are also criminals. I mean, Deripaska, he has at least 3 criminal dossiers, and there are others. And this transgression is very important, because when they are said to invest in election meddling in France or in other European countries, they won't hesitate. We started to begin to have proofs on it, so this is why it's dangerous.
Thanks. You also had a question.
You could just start me. Yeah. I was wondering, the word kleptocracy was named a lot. I was wondering if we zoom out a little bit for me to understand which bigger nations are not kleptocratic. I mean, we're talking about Russia today, and this is specifically about Putin and Russia. I get we dive into that, but I mean, I think in a state of capitalism, eventually some big players end up, and they're gonna bully the system. I think that's kind of inevitable. In what sense do you guys think this is more dangerous than, let's say, I mean, which country wouldn't be kleptocratic? I mean, Turkey is also doing stuff like this. As Netherlands, not a kleptocracy. I mean, in what sense is this extra dangerous?
Okay, so firstly, it's comparative. So, and then secondly is if it's different, how dangerous is it? Okay, anyone pick it up?
Very briefly, I live in France since 3 years, and I often hear, "Oh, France is also kleptocracy. You know, city hall constructed too many roundabouts. There is certainly some money went away, etc." But then I ask, "Do you know what is a raid attack?" And the person doesn't understand the meaning of this word. So in Russia, it's like Honorata was saying in the beginning, it's at the state level. For example, Yukos case is a good example of developed corruption. If the state wants your money, it will take it.
And maybe just one more thing that is different, and I agree that it exists also in other countries. It probably exists to some extent even in liberal democracies. But what is different is that here we don't have the rule of law, right? So the law can be used in any way against you, and it can be used against a very important person and against a person somewhere down the chain, in any way that the authorities decide. And I think this is the crucial difference to understand. If you will go to the courts here, you can be pretty sure will rule so that the evidence, actually proves whether you're guilty or not. in Russia, this is not the case because, as we heard, anything can be evidence and anything can be discarded as no evidence, especially when we are chasing signatures.
But the concept of big, powerful players, especially financially gaming and taking over the system, is that something that is, how unique is that to Russia? That's also part of the question. So, yes, Jonathan?
Well, if we're talking about the size of companies, I think high-tech Silicon Valley, California, what's happening there is a great example of that. We have a very small number of companies with an enormous amount of wealth, but also an enormous amount of power, not just within business circles, but as we've seen in the political sphere as well. But to join what Anastasia was saying in the defence of liberal democracy, and also to defend my former employer, the European Union, we still have the strength in our systems to recognise that power can be abused, which is why the European Commission has been investigating Microsoft and Google and Apple constantly, in great detail, relentlessly, and then fining them huge amounts of money. Now, that doesn't get rid of the problem, but it shows that we're aware of the problem, we recognise that it's serious, and when we have the tools to do something about it, we do it.
Okay, so that's I think that's three people answering. That should be enough, because we really need to go to the second half, where I'm also very curious. Do you think how should states like the Netherlands on a European level or other great powers deal with a country like Russia? How do you hold them accountable? And maybe you already had the microphone, Jonathan, and we spoke about the case, and we spoke about the rule of law. You're trying to win something unwinnable if there's no accountability and truth. How do you deal with it as a foreign person trying to get something legally done in Russia?
I said earlier that this is a battle for truth, ultimately.
Right.
And I think at the same time, it's a battle for the rule of law. I think maintaining the rule of law in one country, in the Netherlands, in France, in the UK, is already a challenge. And it's a fight that never ends. We have to permanently refresh and rebuild and improve our institutions. Maintaining the rule of law between sovereign nations is the ultimate challenge. But I think, again, to speak highly of what Europe has done over the last 60 years, Europe has at least tried to do that. And if I look at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, we have a framework, we have an international framework for the respect of human rights. And Russia has signed up to that. Mm-hmm. The problem is, Russia has failed to implement, I think, more than 1,500 cases. Even worse, I would say, Vladimir Putin has introduced legislation a couple of years ago which allows the Russian Constitutional Court to ignore the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights.
So why sign up in the first place?
Well, and this brings us to the question, and I would almost put this question back to the audience. In that situation, do we keep Russia in the Council of Europe and within the European Court of Human Rights because we want to maintain the dialogue? We want to give Russian NGOs a place to go to. Alexei Navalny and his brother have used the European Court of Human Rights recently. Do we do that, or do we say, well, hang on, if Russia's not playing by even the most basic rules, then what's the point of having them in the club? Mm. And I've spoken to Russian observers about this, and you get different answers. It's really difficult.
So maybe, Harry, because you were already alluding to
human rights.
Well, human rights, obviously, but the Magnitsky Act, this could be one of the ways where if everybody else decides it's going to be super hard for, illegal Russian money to be used abroad, at least we can hit them where it hurts and potentially, create enough pressure inside the country to change so that we can join the international community again. Would that be a good solution?
Yes, I think, well, one additional thing about the European Court of Human Rights in Russia. Mm-hmm. We had a couple of colleagues from human rights NGOs in Russia over in the past days, so I was in some discussion about this matter also, and their plea was very much to continue working with Russia in the Council of Europe. Maybe finding new ways to put Russia under pressure within the Council on non-compliance with European Court of Human Rights verdicts. But there are a huge number of Russians who, on less politically sensitive cases, issues, are still getting justice from the European Court of Human Rights, and this is important to maintain. It's also important to recognize that there is a whole series. 1,500 is not a high number if you look at a place like Italy, where thousands of European courts of human rights verdicts have not been complied with fully, at least. This has to do with the trial system and the time people have to wait in Italy before they go on trial. And maybe if your fair trial rights have been abused in Italy, maybe after a long period you get your individual satisfaction, but full compliance of, in this case, in my example, Italy, with the European Court decision would mean that they would have to reform their system, which they don't do. So they continue to violate the European Convention of Human Rights, and this is so there is quite a broad range of countries in the Council of Europe that should improve their act, and it's one of the things that we would want the European Union to recognize, not just in their foreign policy towards countries like Russia or Turkey or Azerbaijan, but also in their internal policies, that compliance with the European Court verdicts becomes much more important. Then the wider question of what can we do from the international community. Well, international community usually is, traditionally is more or less used as synonymous with the West. This is becoming increasingly less true. In many international organizations you see a shift. In quite a lot of the rule of law cooperation that exists internationally, you see that places that we would normally consider as authoritarian or a dictatorship are becoming increasingly important. One example, Interpol. Interpol has now a Chinese president. The Secretariat is in France. There's a Secretary General who I think is German. Most of the Secretariat staff are from Western Europe. But there is, an increasing number of people who are on the board are no longer from the West. So they are people who represent authoritarian styles of government, who represent places where the rule of law may apply in 90% of issues that are being dealt with by courts, but anything that touches the leading clique, anything that is considered politically sensitive by the leadership, is not covered by rule of law. This is normal practice in Russia, normal practice in China, normal practice in much of the Arab world. We have been doing quite a lot of work with the International Association of Prosecutors, which is a not so well-known international rule of law cooperation outfit. You have Western prosecution services and in some cases also associations of prosecutors working together with their colleagues from around the world, again from these countries. You see that they have about half of their meetings are in Western Europe, the other half of their meetings are Russia,
that's
China,
a very high level
world.
of detail, but I really want to know how do we deal with Russia in that context?
Well, my question is whether we can still deal, with them. I'm saying that we are on the brink of a lot of, previously, international organizations, synonymous with Western, being taken over by, authoritarian countries who have another concept and, a very problematic concept of rule of law. So we must wake up, and we want, in my example about the prosecutors, we are calling on the Dutch prosecutors and the Association of Dutch Prosecutors and their colleagues in Western European countries to please wake up, because they are naive in, cooperating with their colleagues from around the world and, assuming that through some kind of osmosis our values will transfer to them. And this is not true, I think. And,
okay, so a call to action to any Dutch prosecutors in the house, maybe.
So still,
make sure you do that.
I don't think it's for prosecutors, so maybe I can.
If our second chamber wakes up and adopts something like a global Magnitsky Act, and if the European Parliament, well, they have, they in the end they won't decide on this. It's national parliaments who have to decide and pressure their government. Then something may happen.
So at the end, you also answered the question about the Magnitsky Act. You say yes, it should be global. Honorata, you were triggered. You wanted to answer something.
I actually wanted to maybe generalize a little bit more and then go back to the roots. So that's always the way that I go. I think we have a problem. It's
always more complex than you think.
It's always more complex. But I think we just really overestimate the stability of democracy. Because when you look in the grand scope, in the global scope of things, you see that actually democracies, liberal democracies, stable democracies, are in minority. So here in the Netherlands, you are very, very lucky, but it's a very, very fragile balance. And what is going on in Russia, what is going on in China, what is going on in Turkey, with all kinds of authoritarian trends actually inhabiting also international organizations, makes it even more urgent for people here to know how fragile the system is. So the first thing to look at is what is going on internally in the Netherlands. Are the institutions of separation of power really stable? Is there external interference? In the financial sector, what can we do there to see whether our institutions are stable and not influenced by weird money transfers, money laundering, etc.? And I think coming from Poland, some of you probably already detected my accent, this is something that is really, really hurting me at the moment, because I know it's really easy to overestimate the stability of democracy and deter into authoritarian trends, and in the end also having no courts in the country.
Yeah, so we shouldn't overestimate international institutions nor the stability of democracy. I'm hoping you have something more positive to say.
Yes.
Go for action.
I was not going to
go ahead now, please.
I think we should have a look at what works and then try to replicate it and use it more. And even though we think that nothing has worked in terms of constraining and restraining this kleptocratic dictatorial system, some things have worked. The sanctions that have been implemented, especially in the banking sector and the financial sector by the United States and Europe since the Crimea annexation, have actually hurt this slush fund significantly. I will quote one number, which I cannot give you the source, but you'll have to trust me on that. The amount of money that they can no longer launder through the banking system, because the banks that used to be collaborating with them, including German banks, including Swiss banks, want to get rid of as much as possible of that bad money and not accepting new money. At this point, for this year, is 80 billion. So 80 billion remains uninvested. It remains in jurisdictions that cannot be really used for anything. Yeah, in order for them to use them, they have to pass them through a jurisdiction that can make payments. But they cannot do that. And this has happened for the last 4 years. So the amount that has accumulated that they cannot use is more and more. So as long as no new banks in Europe emerge that are willing to cross boundaries and to accept IP to IP payments or whatever they're doing for the disguising of the origin, this will continue and will collapse, because this money cannot be used by them. Second thing that might work is just a result of their own sloppiness. There's another general, Ukrainian former general, once told me that any dictatorial system that is not that does not have ideology behind it, which is the Russian system, that is only money based, will collapse under its own weight sooner or later. So what we're seeing now is there's the MH17 disaster, there's the Skripal thing. more and more countries, European countries that otherwise were generally neutral to the Russian phenomenon, are becoming non-neutral. They're becoming emotionally invested. Their population, their electorate is actually asking the government to take actions. And this, one by one, is resulting in London not accepting easily real estate money anymore from Russians. Some oligarchs from Russia may even not get their visa extensions in the UK. And the Netherlands looking much more and more at actually front companies that are based here with ownership several layers to go up to very often to Dutch-related jurisdictions, but actually looking at who's behind them. And I think this is the naivete that has existed for the last 20 years in Western Europe that is acceleratingly we're getting rid of it.
Okay, so that's already happening. Thanks. I was asking for something positive and I got it.
Yes.
But I'm asking you a slightly different question because you made this movie, of course, together with your co-director. But what are you hoping we're going to do?
Yeah, I wanted first to interact.
Yeah, go ahead and then maybe at the end answer the question. Yeah, sure.
Because Krista said oligarchs are already under the sanctions, etc. But the latest investigation of Bellingcat is about fake passports of Russian agents. And the former head of the Federal Security Service, apparently under sanctions, used a fake passport to go to Europe. So we should not underestimate, kleptocracy, mafia state, etc. I hope that Europe will continue to implement rule of law. Just an example, there's a character in this movie, Jose Grinda, prosecutor from Spain. He, since 10 years, he started criminal proceedings against Russian dirty money invested in Spain. In fact, we, together with Harry, organized an event with him and other prosecutors. I was very surprised, but this is really random. It depends on human factor, on prosecutors, what is their motivation. Very often they are not motivated because they say, oh, we have a rule of law state, we have to send a request to Russia, or what is the predicate offense, from where money comes from. We won't have any response, so we won't start the case. And this is really striking for me. I know that in journalism it's really random when I choose my subject, it's arbitrariness. But in fact, that the same situation exists for prosecutors. It was striking for me. But apparently, the basis of suing dirty money already exists, and it can be improved and implemented.
Thanks. So this is round 2, and I see we're almost out of time. We started a few minutes late, but I do really want to see if there's any questions that we can take from your side about what we should do, how to deal with a state like Russia as it is now, from the perspective of the outside world. Anyone? Or are you all more interested in blinis? What? If it's yeah, okay. Well, we do one last question. How about that? So please go ahead. Could you stand up?
Right. Yes. So I think the panel mostly agrees on something like the Magnitsky Act. In the extension of that, something has been said about financial transparency. We in the Netherlands, as was mentioned, have a lot of letterbox companies flushing through a lot of money. So what should be implemented? Well, you mentioned that there's something being implemented, but actually what should be implemented on the local level or on other levels to really fight this problem? It's not only against Russia, there's also the Ukrainian president and the Moldovan political leader involved in a lot of companies, and so they're all vested into this.
So it's from a financial perspective, what should happen more than just the Magnitsky Act? Yeah, that's a nice question to end off with. Anyone?
Just very briefly, and then I'll happily hand over. I think we should not limit it only to financial, but generally corporate transparency, because a lot of the companies that are headquartered in the Netherlands are just used as pass-through companies, and financing is not going through. But but implementing strictly the sanctions and the money laundering law and the essentially anti-political corruption law would make it possible for these companies also to be liquidated or blocked. There's a very good example that of a company that is based in the Netherlands that has a dominant role in visa acquisition. It's a new investigation that Bellingcat is publishing in about a week, but you're getting an advanced sort of teaser on that.
Right, thank you very much.
Turns out that a Dutch-based company is the holding company for a group of visa service companies that have exclusivity for providing visa services, visa application services, to Dutch people wanting to travel to Russia, and for Russians wanting to travel to the Netherlands. And this is just an example because this Dutch company has subsidiaries in Austria, in Poland, in Lithuania, and several other countries. Embassy, I'll give the example with the Netherlands. The Dutch embassy in Moscow has done a tender, and that tender has been won by one company that has received the monopoly on processing Russian citizens' applications for Dutch visas. We investigated the ownership of that company, which is Dutch-based, and after going through about 7 layers of non-transparency, we identified that the company is owned by 2 Russian gentlemen who both were members of the KGB before 1991. Yes, it doesn't surprise me, but the naivete of a liberal democracy is personified in this particular case.
Right.
How can the Netherlands believe that a company that shows up and wins a tender based on the lowest price of servicing in Moscow is not going to be a planted company? And this is a company that's servicing at the moment everybody who wants to come to the Netherlands, and therefore they're getting advance notice of any potential witness that wants to contact your prosecution for the MH17 case. There are small things that can be done and are being done at the moment, but it took several international disasters for this to become an issue, and that should have been done earlier.
Anything additional from the panel? Thanks for the heads up. Also, probably the Dutch only had time for 5 layers of untransparency, but hopefully there's going to be a lot more Bellingcat in the future to get to the last 7.
Correct.
So thanks so much. Thank you for the panel. How about a big round of applause for the panel? Very interesting. Thanks so much. Anastasia, and also the gentlemen, Harry, Jonathan, and Christo. Thanks so much. And back to you, Olga, probably because you want to.